Good evening. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Inspiration webinar. Inspiration Software is the embroidery software line of G7 Solutions in design and machine embroidery. Our Inspiration Software line includes My Block Piecer, My Quilt Embellisher, My Quilt Planner, Perfect Embroidery Pro, Perfect Stitch Viewer, Stitch Snapshots, and Word Art and Stitches. Tonight's webinar features our Perfect Embroidery Pro, Manual Labor. We have a wonderful team assisting us tonight. Inspiration Tech Support Team of Dory, Tamara, and Chris L. I would like to introduce you to our very own digital design engineer, Katherine Artines. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed tonight's feature.
Thank you, Dory. You always give me such lofty titles. This evening we will take a look at the infrequently used manual stitch tool, and then we'll play with some of the really cool additions to PEP in the last update, 9.04. Manual stitch is just that. It's the ability to create our own stitch length by point placement, and it's always a straight stitch. Let's go into PEP. We'll take a look. I'm going to drag down the ruler guide at 0, drag down 1 at the 1-inch mark. Come up here to our toolbar, and our manual tool is this one right up here. I'll select it. I'm going to come down here and right-click on my red thread so it stands out a little bit. And to use the manual stitch, I click with my mouse, move up to where I want that stitch to be, and click again with my mouse. To end it, I do a right click, and here we have our first manual stitch. To do a little comparison, I'm going to come up here and choose the run stitch right next to manual. I'll put a different color in. Let's do purple. And I'm going to do the same thing, click on the 0, and then come up and click on the 1, so that we can take a look at the differences between our manual stitch and our run stitch. We're going to come down here and choose to turn on the stitch ends. It's not something I normally keep on, but this evening is going to play an important part for us to understand what's happening with our manual stitch. Right now you can see that there's a small white circle up at the top and the bottom of our manual, and then you see multiple white circles on the run stitch. What we're actually seeing here are the stitch points or needle drops. When we do a manual stitch, wherever we click, we're actually putting in a needle drop where the needle on your embroidery machine would actually penetrate the fabric with the thread. Here with our run stitch, we had multiples, and that's because if we take a look over here in properties, by default, the stitch length is 3.0, and that means that the needle is going to drop every 3 millimeters. I have a slide so perhaps you can see a little closer what's happening here. Again, here is our needle drop or stitch point. Remember that I clicked here at the bottom, moved up, and clicked at the top. So I just have the 2 needle penetrations. Whereas on this run stitch, which is set for the stitch length of a 4 millimeter, you see every place the needle will drop into the fabric, therefore creating that stitch length. So that is the main difference between a manual stitch and a running stitch, or some artwork that we turn into a run, is that we are placing the position of the needle drop. Let's go back in. So if I come up here with my manual stitch again and select it, I could click smaller stitches. I could make a shape if I wanted to, just like we do with our artwork, and come down here and even past that and right click. And again, everywhere that we see one of those white circles, click off of it so you can see better, that is where the needle is going to drop into the fabric. Right up front, I'm going to give you a warning about manual stitches. If you click your points 3 inches apart, your stitch is going to be 3 inches long in the software. But software cannot control or exceed the capabilities of your embroidery machine. So do make sure that your machine can handle a long stitch, especially on the horizontal. If you take a look at these two samples of flowers, here I was allowed to create this large satin flower in the software, but when I saved that same flower in a machine format, you see that the machine format itself could not handle the length of those stitches, so some are missing. Most of the newer machines today can do a 9mm horizontal stitch, which is just a bit about over 1/3 of an inch. The embroidery arm can do a long vertical stitch much easier than it can do a long horizontal stitch. And if you think about it, most of our rectangular hoops are taller than they are wide. We have a 6x10, even our 5x7, 7x11, 8x12, 9x14, etc. So you see that the height is the greater of the two. As you take a look here at this flower, you can see that when we create a circle with manual stitch, we do have both vertical and horizontal, so it's something to consider when we're setting the length of these stitches. We're actually creating this flower this evening, so you'll see how it works. If you can't find the maximum stitch length in your manual for your embroidery part of your machine, do make sure to ask your dealer. It is something that you'll want to know. Let's see how we might use this manual stitch tonight. If you were to take a look in the Perfect Embroidery Pro manual that comes with the software online, it's going to tell us these 3 uses for the manual stitch. And you can see right here what they are. I took it a step further and I added in red the kinds of things that those uses might refer to. For example, creating a manual lock stitch would be perfect between letters or perhaps some elements of your design. If we wanted to create random detail work, we could play with shading. Small intricate stitching could be custom edges or fringe. We're going to begin this evening with working with our manual lock stitch or our putting a manual traveling stitch between letters. So we'll start with a clean screen, come up here to File, and I'm going to come down to Import True Type Text. With my caps lock on, I'll type in the word art. I will leave it as the Arial font. Go ahead and OK that. I'm going to size that just a little bit bigger so we can see it. Do a right click, convert to satin. And you can see that our stitch points are turned on from earlier. I'll turn them off for just a moment and turn on our 3D here, and you can see that this is what our word is going to look like. Just as a refresher over here in the sequence view, if I click on the plus, you can see that those satin are individual pieces. The A, the R, and the T are all separate pieces. And if we were to take a look at the commands for any one of those, we see that the default command for that, it's going to trim as an end command. Now, what we're going to work with our manual stitch, if you are doing your project on a home machine for yourself and you aren't concerned with the time required to stitch the design, then the way that this is fine. The ability to have a trim between each of those sets of letters. However, if you are doing a job where time is important or time equals money, or are doing it on a multi-needle machine, perhaps doing the project numerous times, you may want a manual traveling stitch between those letters so that the embroidery machine can keep going. It won't stop and start. It won't do tie-offs. You won't have extra knots on the back of your project and so forth. So it depends on why you're doing it, but we're going to assume that time is money and we want the machine to keep stitching. In this case, we are going to add a manual stitch between the A and the R and the R and the T. The positioning of that manual stitch depends on who you talk to. There are 2 different camps or 2 different feelings in the professional digitizing world. Some digitizers always put their connecting manual stitches at the bottom. Some will put it in the closest distance. So for the A and the R, that's going to be the same whether we put it at the bottom or the closest distance. But if we were doing closest distance between the R and the T, that's going to be here. If we were doing the bottom, of course, it will be doing here. We're going to do both of them. I'll show you what they look like, and you can make the decision, the look that you prefer. To start with, since we're going to be adding a stitch between the A and the R, we want to make sure that the stop and start positions are in the proper order. I'm going to move this button. We always grab the start even though it looks like the red stop is there. I'll drag the stop over here to the edge and put the start back where it should be. I know that I want to connect the A to the R at the bottom, so I'm going to do the same thing with the R. I'll click on that. I know that I'm picking the green. And for the stop, I'm going to put this one at the closest distance between the R and the T, and we'll put the green one back down here closest to where the stop is on the A. We need to also take care of the T and drag that starting position so that it is across from the shortest distance where we placed it at the R. We'll make sure everything has been applied there. So now our stop and starts are prepared. Let's come up here and get our manual stitch. I am going to use red again so that you can see what we are doing. I need to zoom in here, and we'll zoom in quite a bit. And then I will come back and turn on the stitch ends here on the left side, and you see the small white dots that represent my stitch points. I need to grab that manual again since I used my zoom. And at this point, I'm going to click where the stop is on the A and move over where I want that travel to hit, and I'll click and right-click to end it. So I have joined those two areas together. I'll back out with my zoom, and I know now that I need to be up in this position here so that I can join the R and the T at the closest positions. If you don't remember which point was your stop, we certainly can select it again, and even at this point I might drag that up just a little bit so I can control the shortest distance. I know it is at this one. I will get my manual tool, and again it's in red, and I will click and drag over. I can click there to set that point, and if I wanted, I could even continue to go up so that it met with that first underlay stitch. That's not necessary, but I can do that if you prefer. We'll go ahead and zoom back out, and here is our letter, and we do see that we have A connected to R connected to T, which is what we were after. However, at the moment we have not made this so that the machine will stop. First of all, the sequence is not correct over here in sequence view, and also I have two color stops in there. What we're going to do first is come down and click and drag the first manual up and drop it right here on the first satin, which represents the letter A. And we see some expansion on those two areas, so I can close them if I want. I'll come down here and get the manual second and drop it on the satin that represents the R and drop that in position, and I will collapse each of those because now our sequence is correct. A manual, R manual, T, but we're going to still deal with color stops. So the final thing that you would want to do would be to select all items and then choose one color to have all of that represented with one color, and now there will be no stopping and starting, no tying, no extra knots in our letter or in our word art. So that's how we can use manual to bring elements of your design closer together. If we back that out, I turn off the stitches, you can see what it looks like. And here we have the join, and here we have the join with those manuals. So this is one look. You can decide if you prefer the manual stitch to be at the shortest distance. I'm going to back it out just a little bit here and take out I'll leave the A to the R because that would be the same no matter which way that we do this, but I do need to change the stop start in the R if I'm going to do it at the bottom, and I would need to change the stop for the T and drag that to the bottom as well. The difference here would be, we'll zoom in so we can see, the difference would be to grab our manual tool again and to link both of those at the bottom. Now, something else that you can choose to do, I can click and then move over just a little bit to the left and come back on my right and set up a small locking stitch at that point, then move over to my T and click on the starting position, and if I want again, set up a little lock by going right, left, right, and right click when I'm finished. We see the connection there, and once again, so you can have another look at it, I would click on the manual and drag that up and drop it on the A. I would then pick up the second manual, drag and drop it so that it rests on the R, and then finally pick all of my items, change it to one color. Let me zoom back out so that you can see, and here we have the difference where we have all of those manual stitches at the bottom, and you can decide which look you prefer. The other technique that you'll find is different depending on who you talk to with a professional digitizer. Some digitizers will go ahead and clip these stitches once the project is all finished, and some digitizers don't feel the need to clip those and they simply leave those in there, and that would be something else that you could decide. Remember, the reason we did this was to allow the machine to keep stitching without trimming or having any stops. All right, Dory, we'll stop there for a moment. Do we have any questions that have come in yet? We haven't talked a whole lot, but we'll see.
We have just one quickie question from our friend Julie, and she wants to know, when you connect the A to R and the R to T by those run stitches or by those manual stitches, are you able to keep them from fraying if you go ahead and trim them?
If you thought you were going to trim, do you remember, Julie, what I just did in this one? And I showed you here because this is the longer manual stitch, and it really might be something that you might want to go back and trim. So let me show you again. I'm going to undo to show you what I did here. We'll take that out. And I took the manual stitch, and let me zoom in even a little further for you to see it. I took the manual stitch and I started at my point, but then I came to the left and then back to the right. So in doing that, I have a little bit of a lock stitch. If you wanted, you could even do a even one more, a half a stitch, whatever. If you thought you were going to have trouble with fraying, you could even lock that back and forth just a little bit more before you did that jump over to our next letter. And then when you're over here, I could come forward, backward, forward, and right click to end it. So you're giving yourself a little bit of lock stitch when you're working with that manual.
Okay, and we have one other question from our friend Melanie, who suggests, how about scooting over those letters, just a wiggle?
Absolutely. Great idea, Melanie, because here these are independent characters, and if I took that T, I could hold down my control key with my arrow and move it to the left. I'm using the left arrow, and I could scoot that closer so that that stitch would not be as long. Good idea. Very nice. When we're working with, remember, we're working with TrueType font, so these are individual characters. It would be a different scenario if we were working with text, because text by itself, you have other options when you're working with the text, and you certainly can use the kerning feature to bring everything closer together there. But good question and good answer, Melanie.
Okay, and Diana asks, do you always have to put in the manual tie-offs? Sorry, screen needs to be a little bit bigger, getting old.
Mine?
No, mine.
Okay.
Do you always have to put in manual tie-offs, or do you have the ability to put in an auto tie-off on a specific stitch?
On your, we're going to talk about manual, and we can do that now because I've not placed those in between everything. But with our manual, one of the things that is also different are your properties. You don't have as many properties offered to us with the manual stitch. Do you see here where we really only have two groups? We have the command area, which beside the color gives us a start command and an end command, where we can start that manual with a trim or jump normal, or if I take the last one that was between our R and our T, instead of my backtracking on that manual, we could have perhaps started that, no, I don't want to do that. I probably would still do it the other way that I did it when I did back and forth, back and forth. If you want to trim it, the idea here though, if we trim, what we're doing is we're sort of negating why we did this in the first place. You do have the ability to set those up on a manual stitch. However, in this particular situation, when I'm showing you a way that you can add your manual so that your machine does not stop, it just keeps stitching for time, then it really wouldn't make any sense to put our trim in if that's what we're putting our manual stitch in to avoid. But the other area that we have our properties is width and height. Certainly when we're talking about a long stitch here, the width is not, or in this case the height is not applicable. But you'll see we have very few properties, and the main one that's missing here is the stitch length. And of course we can't set that as a property because you are setting it whenever you click with your manual stitch. Let me show you, we'll continue on with some of the other things we're doing with our manual stitch, and maybe some of these thoughts will become a little clearer. The questions are great so far, so I appreciate those questions. You're actually paying attention with our manual stitch here. We're going to talk about the random detail work, which in this case is going to be shading. And with our shading, I have a document prepared for us where I've put together two of the free designs that have come with your software. So if you want any reference, there it is right up at the top. Turn on our 3D, and I wanted to show you what professional looking shading looks like so that when we play around with it, you'll see sort of where we're headed. And in this baby carriage, I'm going to grab that gray shading that's in there, which is the perfect color for that carriage, but I'm going to put in an odd color so you can see, oops, you can actually see where that shading is taking place. I'm going to do the same for the butterfly. Let me click on that shading and I'll put in something weird like blue so you can see it. And then when we zoom in, you can tell how the professionals did the shading, and you can see that it is irregular lengths of straight stitching. All right, and if we come over here to the bonnet of the carriage, you can see where they decided to put the shading in, and all of that shading is trying to emulate the roundness of the baby carriage. If we come over to our butterfly, you can see that that also is straight stitch of irregular length, and it is very sparse. And very often when we add manual stitch on top of other stitch, we do want to keep it sparse, not dense at all. So again, the reason I brought this up to show you was to point out how shading is done professionally. Let's come into our clean screen here. Going to a new one. I'm going to come up to Symbol, and we'll use our drop-down arrow and do a select. The apple that's here, I'm going to click and drag on our screen. While I'm getting my symbols, I'm going to go back in alphabetical order and look for my flower 01. Do a double click and drag a size of my flower on screen, turn on the 3D, and we'll zoom in to our flower. And what I want to show you here is to add, how to add some shading with your manual stitch tool. Again, our manual tool is up here. I'm going to choose purple so that you can see what I'm doing. We'll change the color afterwards. But with our manual stitch now, I'm going to click in the red so that the stitch starts under the center of the flower, and I'll click and come back down and go up and click and down and click, and you can see what I'm doing here. I'm really just giving myself a very large zigzag, if you will, that's close together, and up and down, click up, and then I'm finished here, so I'll click one more time and then right click to end. And you can see that I've added some dense shading or veins, if you will, to the inside of our petal. I'll do it again. Down, up, down, up, down, up, and I'm really not concerned how or where I put those stitches because we do have some editing capabilities. Let's go ahead and get our zoom and zoom in on this purple. We will select the purple, the first one that we did here. Normally when we go to edit and we have points like this, our first tool that we would normally go to is the shape tool. But if I click on that, you can see that no points appear on my manual stitch. The tool that we actually want to use for manual stitch is this tool, the fourth button down on the left, and it is your stitch tool. Once I do that, and I'll also turn on my stitch ends, you can see those white circles, but now that I have that tool selected, do you see when I run up onto that stitch point or needle drop, it sort of exaggerates and I can pick that up easier. So I could click on that and drag that point wherever I might want to do my editing, if I want it longer, shorter, if I want these closer together. Let me come down here and pick up my purple one and drag that down. I might want them to make sure that they are within that red. I could maybe angle this one out a little bit, do whatever it is that I wanted to do with those points. I could come over here and do a little editing as well, space those out, and so forth. So yes, we have editing capabilities on our manual stitch. I'm going to zoom back out here, whoops, not that much, with our flower, and take a look now. I'll turn off my stitch points, and if I wanted, I could continue to add additional manual stitching to each of my petals, or I could select one of them, come up here and do a copy, paste, drag that over, rotate it, position it where I wanted it, come back up here, paste another, drag that into position, and I might even want to do a flip horizontal so that they're not exactly the same. Drag that and drop it, and then I would paste one more and probably flip that, a vertical flip, and perhaps size it, rotate it, whatever I wanted to do to drag that in, and now I have some shading in my flower. But it looks funny because I have all of these jump stitches, and that was because of the order that I actually pasted those and positioned those. So what we want to do, this is a little refresher for you. I'd come over here in my sequence, select all of the purple, come up here to edit, and down to optimize sequence. And then it takes care of most of those jump stitches for me. The next thing that I would want to do is I want those purple shading to stitch out before the red dot. So I will click on the purple, drag it up, drop it on the yellow part, and you can see now it will stitch in the proper order. Let's take another look at shading. We'll put some here in our apple. Get that on the screen. And I'll go back and select my manual tool here. I'm going to choose yellow to add the shading to my apple. And here I could start my shading with my zigzag. And all I'm doing is going back and forth, trying to keep it somewhat close together, but I'm doing irregular lengths of the zigzag to add some shading. And again, just a back and forth, back and forth. This is a great one for you to play with. There's no right or wrong as to what you might end up with. I'm not even going to be concerned that some of my points are outside my apple because I know that I can edit those when I'm finished. I'll do a right click to end it, and you see some of the shading that I've added on the curve to even help with that look of the dimension. And I do have some editing that I want to do to my point, so I'm going to come up here and zoom in just a little bit more, start at the top. And one of the things I'm going to do is come over here to my sequence view on the apple. Notice that it has that eye. I'm going to click on that eye to hide my red stitches of the apple. This way, when I edit my yellow points, I don't have to worry about grabbing one of those red stitches instead. And at this point, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit more so you can see what I'm going to do here. And remember to do any editing. I'll turn on my stitch ends, but I come up here to the stitch tool so that those points will pop out for me. I can take my points and do a little bit more editing for them, size them, position them. I did do a very good job with this one. And now I see a situation right here where I have a long stitch and I might want to put a couple more stitches within this area. So I have another capability with this stitch tool edit. I'm going to right click and choose Insert After. And do you notice now that stuck to my mouse pointer is the ability to come down and add another point. I simply clicked once. I can move again and click, come back, click, and move that mouse wherever I want. And you see that I have actually added additional stitches between the ones that were there. And I can then go in and do some editing for those points. Let's take a look and see that again. Just so you're comfortable, let me drag this one out of the way a bit. So right in here, I would right-click, Insert After. There it is stuck. I'm going to come down here and click, up and click, down and click, up and click, and right, let me see here. I'll do it one more time, and I'll show you what happens if you accidentally cross over, like I have here with my stitches. Not a problem at all. I simply get that one stitch and drag it to where I want. This might have been one of those points I was outside my apple. I can certainly tell that when I turn my red back on. And you can see here that we can just go about and do any of our choice changes or editing that we want to do with our apple. I'll come back, choose my Select tool, and over here in Sequence View, turn my eyeball back on so I see my apple, turn off my stitch points, and there's some of that shading in there as well. So manual stitch will allow you to do this. This shading right here that I've just added to the apple, this might be a good example of, at the end of that command, you might want to set your trim. Up to you, but you have that choice to do so. At this point, you could continue to go up and get your manual stitch tool, add some dark green to your apple, maybe add a little reflection square, but the idea is one of the things that we can play with our manual tool is to add shading. I have one more to show you, and then we'll stop for questions. I'm going to go back into my symbols and pick this flower right here because one of the other reasons why we might want to look or use our manual tool is to add small intricate stitching, and my suggestion here was to maybe give different edging to an existing design. Now I do have this blown up about 600%, so that's why the threads look a little sparse, but let's go ahead and get our manual tool again. I'm going to once again pick a color that you can see what I'm doing, and this is very similar to what I just did with the shading on the yellow flower, but this time I'm just kind of adding a irregular border, giving some spikes to this particular flower. I could go in and change some of the points and make them even more irregular if I wanted to, move them over just a bit, maybe drag that guy a little bigger, and I can continue to do that with each of these ends. Notice that I am starting my manual stitching inside the flower. I don't start my first stitch up here on the outside, because this way that stitching will be anchored down by the stitching that falls on top of it, a right click and so forth. I then would continue as we did with our yellow flower, and I'd probably do a copy paste and drag those into position. I'd simply continue to paste and drag, and then at the end I'm going to go in and rotate and position and so forth these particular designs and hide them behind my flower. Go in there, and I would do the other two things as well, where I would want to resequence for the optimum to get rid of all my jump stitches, or as many as possible. And also with this, I can do a rotate. I can also do a flip horizontal, vertical. I can size them so each one is not the same. And what we come up with, we'd have to put all of that color, I'd select it and drag it and drop it right on the green, so it's going to stitch behind the color. But let me show you what it ends up looking like if we have fun with that flower. You can give a little spikes with your manual. Notice that I gave a little spiky look to our leaves and stems and so forth. So that's just another example of how you might want to use your manual stitch. Dory, we'll stop there. Do we have questions?
Oh, yes, we do.
Okay.
Okay, first of all, our friend Diana wants to know, do you have a way to see a faded view of the apple so you don't have to guess while you add shading?
Let's see here.
What about turning off the eyeball?
Well, that faded it all the way. When we turn on the eyeball, it actually hides the red, so it didn't fade it, so we can't soften it. It's not quite like we can do when we have the backdrop tool. Nothing comes to mind right yet. Because we already have the stitches in there, one of the things you might want to do, I don't use it very often, but to show the, nope, that's not what I want, to turn off the 3D, if that helps you, but it turns off the 3D for everything. You can see all of our flowers. If you zoom in on that, that also doesn't make it very easy to see the yellow that you're doing. So at the moment, I can't think of anything, but I can, oops, turn it on, all kinds of things here. Nothing comes to mind at the moment to just fade that apple. You might be thinking, again, of the ability to fade when we have a backdrop. We can fade our backdrop so we don't see its full color, or the new properties when we are working with artwork, we have the ability to do the opaque or opacity, but not on something that has stitches.
Yes, but you can create an outline at a zero distance so that you could.
Okay, I like that. Let's pick the red.
That was from our friend Cindy.
Very nice, Cindy. I'm going to...
and then you could turn off the red eyeball. I like the red eyeball.
And what Cindy is asking here, if I can actually get where I want to be.
The question was from Diana, and Cindy suggested.
Cindy's suggestion is a good one. So let's take a look at what she has offered us. I have just the red part of the apple selected, and I also had to come up here and do an ungroup because the apple came in grouped. So at this point, with the red selected, I would do a right click, create outline, and set it to a zero distance and OK. I don't care that it's a different color. Now I can come up and do the hide eyeball on my apple, and I have that outline. That's a great suggestion, Cindy. Love it. Because here now we have that outline of the apple, and we can get that shading to the outline that's actually acting as a template for us. So nice work, ladies. Good job.
Yes. Isn't it great just to kind of pool our minds? Love it.
It is. That's what we're doing. That's what we do every well, once a month, every Tuesday, is to get together, and I'm just the leader, but we certainly are sharing everything that we're doing here. So thank you, ladies. The next area that we're going to play in is fringe, and you've probably seen designs with fringe. Here's a project I did back in 2008 for the magazine using a fringed lion. The idea behind the article was to buy pieces of clothing, hopefully on the clearance rack, and then with a little bit of embroidery and sewing, we can make it look like a match. Let's do a close-up of that lion. And here you can see some fringe. Fringe is dimensional. It actually comes away from the fabric. And it's really just long, straight stitches that have the bobbin threads clipped on the back. Or in this case, some clipping was done on the front. We trim away the bobbin threads from the wrong side, and that lets the top threads become loose and pop out from the fabric and form a fringe. When creating fringe, there are 3 things for you to remember, and I have them written for you here so you can review them at your leisure. But the first thing is that the fringe must be on top of any other elements so that it isn't matted down and you can get to the bobbin threads to do the trimming. For example, if you look at our flower right here, these leaves are stitched first, and then the fringe is stitched after those leaves. Also, there must be some other embroidery on top of one edge of the fringe to anchor the other edge of the stitches. So here we have a center to this flower, and it is laying on this inner edge of all of this manual stitch so that when we trim the bobbin, that edge is anchored to our fabric. And last, fringe is a bit see-through, so you don't want any underlay or short stitches behind it, so we'll take care of that as well. All right, we're going to start with an easy one. Come into a clean screen. We're going to find it under Text Designs with our drop-down arrow and choose our applique shapes. And let's drag all the way down to the bottom, and we have a cute little whale that's going to come up on our screen. Remember, this is a applique design. We're going to add a little bit of fun by putting in an eyelashes area right here on our whale. So let's zoom in on the area we're going to play with. I start with coming to my artwork tool, choosing an ellipse, and click and drag a rather long oval. I'll select it. I'm going to change the color so it's not blue. And I'll start with coming in here with my shape tool, clicking and dragging around my 2 edges, my 2 end points, and I'm going to right click and make those line. I'll then select the 2 middle ones and drag those down, and I very easily have created a slice, what will now be the template for my fringe. I'll go ahead and do a select, rotate that just a little bit, place it where I want it, and I'll come in. I'm going to zoom in first before I make some choices here, and I'll choose my manual tool again, and red will work. I am using the lines that I've drawn here as my template. So I'm going to start my manual up here above the line and then come down, and I'm simply doing what I did in the shading. I'm just doing it, oops, I'm too high. I'm just doing it closer together because I want the fringe to look somewhat full, and you can see that I'm using those lines for my template. And I would go back and forth, clicking with my manual tool until this slice was finished. Now, I will right-click to end it. You can see a little bit of jag right here. I certainly would want to go in and make sure that those points, I would do some editing. I was doing it quickly here, but I would make sure that those points are definitely past this line because they need to be anchored with our next portion of the design. I'll open up the next area, what I already have created for us. Let's zoom in here, and oops, I'm going to go open the other guy. That one I opened was all finished, so let's take a look at him. Here is the manual stitch completed. We'll turn on our 3D so you can see those stitches, and at this point I need to put something on top of those on this edge of the stitches so that it anchors it to the fabric. Once again, I'm going to get my ellipse tool. I'll do a long oval, select it, change the color so you can see the difference. I'm going to rotate it and bring it down and make sure that it is long enough, and I'll drag it out just a little bit more. That should work, and I might rotate it just a bit, and I've done this so you can see how I really would put this additional piece in. I'm going to zoom in, choose my shape tool, and drag both of these again down into this area, making sure that I've got all that top upper area covered with this line. You can see what I've done here, and then I might get this to be a little narrower. Select it, right click, convert to complex fill. I would come over here just to be on the safe side and make that density less. I might even drop it down to a 3 because I definitely want to make sure that those upper threads are covered. Let's zoom back out, and there's our eye. This is how it would be stitched. If we take a look at our slides, you can see that this is what our whale looks like when it's stitched. Those are all the long manual stitches. And when they're trimmed appropriately from the back, you can see how those threads pop from your fabric. Here you get a better look. I've taken a picture from the top of the whale, and you can see how cute that fringe is looped. Now I have another situation we're going to see all of these steps, but this was our first one, and you can see how easy really it is to create that. Let's go back to the software. I'm going to open our Start, and in this project we are going to create the flower that you saw earlier. And in this case, I have started this design with 2 artwork pieces, the outer circle, which is 1.75, the inner circle, which is 0.75, and that means that my manual stitch will be just about a 1/2 inch, and that's probably as large as I want to go at this point. Now, we saw how time-consuming it would be to do a manual stitch, but if I were doing it with manual stitch, since that's what tonight is all about, this is how I would go about it. You can see that I have the ruler guides set at a vertical and horizontal center. I'm going to go back to the ruler and click and drag another guide down. If you've been with me before, you know how much I like and use these ruler guides. And what I want to show you now is to offer for you what is in the new update, that 9.04, the ability to play with these guidelines. I've dragged this down from the ruler. I'm going to do a right click and choose angle. The box comes up, a drop down arrow, and I'm going to choose 45 and OK that. And you can see how cool this is. It has now given me an angle line at 45. Perhaps now you can understand why I gave myself that vertical center, so that I have now just split that arc into 2 equal pieces. Let's do it again. Drag it down, right click, angle. This time I'm going to do a 135 and OK it. Drag that into position. And one more time to show you how really cool this is. In the angle, I can actually set my own custom angle, 22.5, and you can see that it has set that angle to split these 2 equally. So I could continue to do that and use these angle lines to my benefit. The other beauty is I can right click it, change the color, maybe choose a green for this particular angle if I was giving myself some kind of notation. And finally, I can, let me right click on that, and I can remove just one angle line. Whereas before we had to do a right click and remove all of them. So I very much love those new additions to our ruler guidelines. But if we continue with our project, I would choose manual, and I would do just what I did with our whale. I would click and use these 2 circles as my template and make those manual stitches as close to each other as I could for the fullness, etc., etc. And we already talked about, yes, this would be time consuming. Let me open up the next one that I have done for us for you to see that I did take the time to set those manual stitches. I did all of my editing for my points. And once I had that first arc done, remember that I've divided this circle into 8 equal parts. I could then do a copy, paste, and I'm going to use my rotate once button, drag that into position, paste it again, rotate it twice, drag that into position, and continue to do that until I have a full circle for my flower. And I left these in the colors, different colors, so you could see that indeed I would have copy-pasted and positioned those in those 8 areas. To finish our flower, we need to do a drop-down artwork, choose our ellipse. I'm going to hold down my control key and drag a circle, select it, make sure it's big enough. I'm going to make that a 0.8. I would drag this to the center of my flower and making absolutely sure that I have covered all of those inner stitches with this circle. I would then do a right click, convert to complex fill. I'm going to come over here to the fill type and not leave it at standard, but do something fun. Embossed, apply it, and I will go ahead and for the moment I'm going to add a new color and make that center a new color. Right click, create the border. We'll finish that off nicely. And then I'm going to come over here in my sequence and select, holding down my shift key, select all of those colors, change it to yellow for a flower, and then if I really wanted realistic here, I'll do my blue and make that an orange center, and here I have our first flower. Now, in doing this flower, we were limited with our stitch length size based on what we know about our machine and so forth. There is a trick if you want a fuller looking flower, and I've done one here to show you that you can create 2 different circles with your manual stitch. If I select that orange and, oops, pick the wrong one here, select my orange and drag it out of the way, you can see that I've created a second circle. I did it the same way I did that original yellow one, but I did add that bean stitch that's going to anchor that inner stitch for all of this fringe. You have to have that anchor in there so that when you snip your bobbin thread, all the thread doesn't fall out. So this would be my bigger flower. Now let's take a look at all of the steps that you would do to finish your flower. Here is the yellow flower all stitched out with that manual stitch. On the back you see the black bobbin thread, and I purposely did black so you all could see it easily, and for myself as well when we go to do the snipping. Here on this double circle you can see that there's a double row. There's a bobbin black stitch for the pink and a black bobbin stitch for the blue as well. Our next step would be to take small sharp scissors and to trim that black bobbin thread around the entire circle. Be very careful not to clip your pink or you're going to clip your loops. So you'll clip your black and then insert your scissors on the front and sort of gently work out those threads from the fabric, and then you can see how darling that comes out with the loops right here. Here we have our yellow flower with the loops. And one other thing to point out, there really are 2 ways to cut fringe. This, as I showed you the first way, this is really the traditional way, cutting the bobbin threads away, and that gives you the looped fabric. But the other option is if you take your scissors and from the front snip or clip right around the edge of your blue thread. Be very careful not to pick up the pink threads, you'll cut them, but just the blue. Notice that if you cut from the front, you get a straight fringe, as is shown right here. This I would suggest you do as more of an advanced technique. Play around with the original cutting the bobbin thread and so forth a couple times so you understand what's happening there. But just to show you again the difference, if you want looped fringe, you're going to cut the bobbin threads on the back. If you want straight fringe, as we saw in the lion, you're going to cut from the front. This one was easier to cut from the front because there was no additional stitches I had to work around or to worry about. So there you have your difference in those fringes. And here is our finished project with our fringed flower. Here's our little purple guy you saw that we sort of did some abstract funky stuff with our manual stitch with behind and in the green and so forth. So there you have your design. Now, before I stop and ask for questions, I'm going to cover one other thing because I'm sure there's someone out there that is questioning, why am I spending all of that time with manual stitch and making sure everything is the same when we could use another way. So let me come back to our artwork. I'll delete all of the blue manual stitch. I'm also going to turn off our guidelines so that we are left with the inner circle, outer circle of our flower. The other way that you can do fringe is with your satin stitch. What I would do here is to select both items, come up here with combine. This is now one item, right-click, convert to satin. I'll turn on my 3D so that we can see what's happening here. And I also want to turn on those stitch ends. You can see all of those needle drops within this satin. And this is what we need to pay attention to if you are doing your fringe using a satin stitch. So we would come over to underlay, over on properties, take out any underlay that might be in there by default and apply. We also want to come over here to commands, oops, not commands, pardon me, in our apologize for this thought process. There we go. In our properties general, what we are looking for here is our short stitches. We're going to remove the check mark and apply. And you can see I'm removing some of those needle drops, but I still have the needle drops in the middle. And that's because of the length of the satin stitch. It wants to do a split satin. The default is set to random. I'm going to use my drop down and say none and apply, and that's how you get your satin stitch to be the full length that we would need for our fringe. Now you certainly would continue adding the center of that flower so we anchor this inner edge and so forth, but you do have two ways to do fringe, but tonight was about the manual stitch, so that's what I chose to show you. All right, now I'll stop for questions. Dory, do we have any others?
Well, friend Diana has hung in there with us, and she wants to know, can you alter the outside edge of the to be longer and shorter without having to move each stitch point? So can you get a random edge on the outside?
If I have this particular satin stitch, one of the options that we have, and we happen to be right in the proper properties column, do you see this right here that says Jagged type? We've played with this before, way back in the very first webinar I ever did. Come in here and use a drop down, and you would need to decide how it was drawn to decide whether it was the first or second stitch that you're trying to work with. I'm going to choose first in this option, and I'll set the jagged to be a 2 millimeter and apply. And what you see here is the jagged was applied to the center, which could be a very cool look. But if we want, I'll do an undo there and go back into jagged and choose the second edge. Again, I'll do, let's do a 3 millimeter this time and apply. And this is how you get the jagged edge, that in and out that she was just asking about. And you can apply that to satin stitch and get a very cool look. If we were to go back and take a look at our funky flowers that we did, I think it was, take a look at this one. If we picked our yellow, let's not do that one, let's do this pink one here. If we chose the edges for this pink flower here, we could even have it be a little funkier in addition to our manual. Once again, we go under column, and I would set the second and probably to a 2 millimeter and apply, and once again we get that irregular jagged edge. So that's easy enough to do.
My goodness, that looks like me on a bad hair day.
It doesn't.
Whoa!
It's fun though.
Is there a max for the jagged edge? Do you know?
Well, the max is going to be on your, let's see here, on your area right here with the jagged edge. And let's just pick. We can set, if I pick something weird, I'll just pick an 8 and apply. It's going to be one of those things that it either, that did work, but do you remember back when I talked about what the maximum you need, each person has to find out based on their machine, what is the longest single stitch that can be done on their embroidery machine. And it's in the embroidery part, not the sewing part. It would also depend on that maximum based on your machine's capabilities.
Ah, okay, that makes sense. Now, let's just reverse that. We had another question from another one of our ladies who wants to know, what is the shortest stitch that you should be working with?
Well, the should, you have to think about, when you talk about stitch length, and here on our green part of our apple, we see the stitch length right here in millimeter. The stitch length is just that. It's where the needle drops are going to happen. But you have to think about what kind of fabric you're working with. You want the thread to lay across the fabric and show. That's what embroidery is all about, is to look at the beauty of the thread and allow that thread to catch light. And the length of the stitch, the longer the stitch, the more that thread is going to show, and also the loftier that thread stitch is. If you get into very small stitch lengths, your thread runs the risk of sinking into the fabric. Even if you do use some kind of topper, if you think about it, a 1/2 millimeter is so very tiny, and you're asking a stitch to do that. Your machine will probably do it, but it's not going to give you a very pretty look for your design and have it be on your fabric. So the question, I can answer that by, you can go as small, if I were to create a run stitch here, and I selected that and went into my stitch length, I could drop that down to a 0.5 millimeter and apply it. Do you see how tight that stitching, that embroidery is going to be? And that is not going to be as lovely as a stitch length that is farther apart. So the answer is very, very small, but your question should be, do you want to?
Yes, and I was just going to say, it's not how small your machine will handle it. It's just you want it to look icky.
Right, and it will look icky. Technical term there.
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, before we go, and I know we're right on the hour, but there is one other nifty tool that I wanted to show you that came along with the update 9.04. And if we take a look back here at our project, do you see where I have some stems that I used with the flower heads? Now, the flower heads were all custom. We did that on our own, but here there's different stems, and I'll show you quickly how I did that. I started with, there's 2 ways you could do it, but here is the design that was brought in, once again, from our PEP free designs, and there's the reference number if you want to go get it. But to isolate our stems, it's very easy to get rid of the rows. I'm coming over here to our sequence view, and I will select the parts of the rows that I do not want, and I will delete those. All right, I'm left with 3 leaves. I only want these 2 leaves. So let's zoom in on our 3rd leaf, and I'm going to show you the other really cool addition, one of many, of that 9.04 update. If you take a look at your stitch tool on the flyout arrow, we now have Lasso as part of our stitch. You may remember that we've always had the lasso up here on the select tool, but it works a little differently. I really like this new lasso tool that's part of the stitch tool. What I do, you can see there's my little lasso, and I'm going to click and hold my mouse key down and drag carefully in those stitches here and around here and back up to the top. And when I let go, do you see I have all of those stitches selected? I'm simply hitting the delete key on my keyboard. I then want to zero in on these few stitches that are left, and I could use my lasso again if I was feeling I had this steady hand, and I could drag around those few. Or I could also use my stitch tool and right-click on that point and ask it to delete the stitch. Having deleted one, I can now just hit the delete from my keyboard, and do you see it is deleting those additional stitches in order, and I can get rid of as many of those extra that I feel are necessary. When I zoom back out, here is my stem that I borrowed from one of the designs you already have, and using that lasso tool, very, very cool tool, I can then select area of the design and delete it. Now, if I wanted, I can go get all of my flower. I'll do a copy, come back to my rose stem and paste that in, drag it into position, and I want to cover that little bit of edge. And there we have it, and you can also see that this is done in the proper order for our fringe because the stems will be stitched out first. So that's just another tool that we were given with Update that really is just a very cool tool to use. Very quickly, I just want to commend all of you for owning digitizing software, for owning Perfect Embroidery Pro, because this is the kind of thing that you can do with it. Many, many things we can play with. But here is a fine example of using existing designs that you have and making them fit your needs. Also creating something from scratch that is very unique and adding your own personal touch to a design you might already own. And truly, this is the beauty and the fun of our software, is you can make unique designs, custom designs, things that are truly yours. People who do not own software, Perfect Embroidery Pro, they are limited to using existing designs and to the editing capabilities that may come with their embroidery machine. So I very much applaud all of you for making the investment, and hopefully you're just getting tremendous amount of fun from doing that. So I think you've all done a very good thing. Tonight we saw some uses of the manual stitch. It's one of our many options. Again, it's an option. You saw that you could either choose manual stitch or satin to do a fringe. I do hope you will play with it. In July, the webinar is Lazy Days of Summer. We'll be looking at shortcuts, things that make our digitizing life easier. One of the shortcuts that will be covered is the new name drop feature. It's very cool, and cool is what we're going to need for that July heat. Dory, before I say goodnight to everybody, are there any other final questions that we need to address?
No, there is not. You've done a fantastic job.
Thank you, Dory, and thank you, ladies. Thank you for the great questions. I love when I have to stop and think for an answer. It's very fun for me, so I appreciate all of that tonight. And again, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you next month.